Hi students! In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the attributes of shapes. What are the attributes of shapes though? The attributes or the properties are just the things that make shapes different from one another. It can be the number of sides, the lengths of those sides, the size of the angles, or whether or not those lines are parallel. These attributes make each and every shape unique, and that's why they're so special. Did you know that you can actually group shapes based off of those properties? In today's lesson, we're going to create a visual hierarchy that will allow us to group those shapes based off of those attributes we just talked about. What is a hierarchy though? I'm about to show you guys an example of one. In this example, we're going to be looking at a hierarchy of chips. And the chip that I have today is this Cheeto Puff. So I want you to think about the broadest way that you could describe this Cheeto Puff. In my opinion, the broadest way that I would describe the Cheeto Puff is to say that it's food. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a big circle to represent this big category. And we're going to call this food. Now, what kind of food is this Cheeto Puff? I would say that it's a chip. So I'm going to create another circle to show the subcategory of the chip. So I'm going to write chip right here. Now we're going to ask ourselves, what kind of chip is the Cheeto Puff? And from the name of it, we know that it's a Cheeto. So I'm going to create another subcategory, and we're going to call this one a Cheeto. And if we wanted to get even more specific, we could say that the type of Cheeto that this is a Cheeto Puff. So we're going to create another subcategory, and we're going to call this Cheeto Puff. And since this is a Cheeto Puff, we're going to place it right here to show us the hierarchy. Now the next thing that I have is this right here. Now this is also a Cheeto, but this is one of the thin, crunchy Cheetos. So we're going to start at the top of our hierarchy, and we're going to ask ourselves, is this Cheeto a food? And we know that the answer is yes. So we're going to move on down to this subcategory. Is this Cheeto a chip? It is. So now we can move on to this subcategory and ask ourselves, is this a Cheeto? And we know it is a Cheeto. But is it a Cheeto Puff? It's not a Cheeto Puff. This is the thin, crunchy Cheeto. So the only category that it doesn't belong in is the Cheeto Puff. So we're going to leave this right here in the subcategory Cheeto. Now the last object that I have is this. And this is a pumpkin spice donut because it's fall, and we all love pumpkin spice, right? So we're going to do the same process with this donut, and we're going to ask ourselves, is this donut a food? And yes, we can eat it, so it is a food. But is the donut a chip? No, it's not a chip. I look at this as like a dessert. So it can't go into the chip category, and it can only go in the food category. It can't go down anymore. And this is an example of a hierarchy. In the same way that we created a hierarchy of chips, we're now going to create a hierarchy of shapes. Before we do so though, let's talk about the attributes that make a square, and a rectangle. So let's think about a rectangle. We know that a rectangle has two sets of equal sides. It also has two sets of parallel lines, and it has 4 right angles. But guess what? A square has all of those same properties too. That means that a square is a specific type of rectangle, just like a Cheeto is a specific type of chip. So with that being said, there's only one thing that sets a square apart from a rectangle, and that's that all squares have 4 equal sides. So now that we know that, we're going to go create a hierarchy of shapes. In this example of a hierarchy of shapes, I've already went ahead and put our broadest category, which is polygons. Now we know that all the shapes we're working with are going to be polygons. Now let's move on to a more specific but still a broad type of subcategory. Right here we've got the hexagon. Now how many sides does a hexagon have? It has 6 sides, so that's why hexagon is by itself. Next we're moving on to a quadrilateral. And how many sides does a quadrilateral have? It has 4 sides, so it is in its own category. Next we have a triangle, and we know that triangles always have 3 sides, so we've got triangle over here. So these are all different because of the number of sides that they have. But let's move on down from the quadrilaterals. Next we've got a trapezoid and a parallelogram. Now both of these are quadrilaterals, so that's why they both come down like this. Now a trapezoid has 1 set of parallel lines, which are these 2, and a parallelogram has 2 sets of parallel lines, which is this set, and then we've got this set. Now if you move on down from the parallelogram to a new subcategory, we have our rectangle and our square. And a rectangle and a square both have 2 sets of parallel lines in these. And that's why a rectangle and a square are also a parallelogram. And in the last part of our lesson, we talked about how rectangles and squares share some of the same attributes. And we can see how a rectangle and a square has 4 right angles. They both have 2 sets of parallel lines, and they both have 2 sets of lines that are equal to each other. Now the only thing that makes a square different is that the sides are all equal. As in a rectangle, we have these 2 that are equal and these 2 that are equal. Now one thing that I do need to clear up is that all squares are rectangles. There are a specific type of rectangle, but not all rectangles are squares. And you might be thinking, how does that work? Well, if that confuses you, think back to our Cheeto example. We know that all Cheetos are chips, but are all chips Cheetos? No, they're not. We have Doritos, we have Lay's, we have so many different kinds of chips, and not all of them are Cheetos. And that's the same way that a rectangle and a square works. So all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. I hope that this gives you a better understanding of how to create a hierarchy of shapes, and this is going to come in handy as we continue to move along and complete other assignments in this module. Thank you.